Before they faced bullets, American soldiers faced liver loaf, oxtail terrine, and something called mock turtle soup. These weren't fancy. They were fuel. Strange by today's standards, but standard issue for the greatest generation. From mock chicken legs to barley stew with canned milk, these 25 real meals were served in U.S. Army camps during World War II, and they kept the boys marching. Let's dig in, because history was won on more than just bravery. It was won on guts and gut lining. 1. Cold oxtail terrine with pickled onions. Imagine lining up in a metal cafeteria, tray in hand, boots muddy from drills, stomach growling. And what do you get? A thick, cold slice of jellied cowtail staring back at you like something that fell off the back of a butcher truck in slow motion. Welcome to oxtail terrine, the Army's version of fine dining, if your idea of fine dining is meat encased in wobbly, glistening aspic. Oxtails were simmered for hours until tender, then chilled into a gelatinous slab of protein-rich jelly. Stackable, sliceable, and shelf-stable. It was everything a mess hall loved and a soldier feared. Toss a few sour pickled onions on the side, and you had a dish that walked the fine line between survival and surrender. To modernize, it sounds like a punishment, but back then, it was better than rehydrated beef cubes and had just enough flavor to remind you it once belonged to a cow. Soldiers didn't complain. They chewed, swallowed, and hoped dessert wasn't prunes again. Some even developed a taste for it, not because it was good, but because it was familiar. In a world where everything else could change overnight, the strange consistency of oxtail terrine was oddly dependable. Just you, your tray, and one quivering slice of World War nutrition. 2. Beef heart stew with canned rutabagas. Now here's a meal that sounded like punishment, but actually packed a punch. Beef heart might make modern diners squirm, but in World War II Army camps it was considered a lean, efficient cut, full of protein, iron, and exactly zero waste. Toss it in a pot with onions, black pepper, and a few sad scoops of canned rutabaga, and boom, you had stew fit for a sergeant. The flavor? Surprisingly bold. Beef heart has the richness of steak, but with a chew that reminded you this wasn't exactly filet mignon. The rutabagas added bulk, and just enough sweetness to balance the iron-heavy meat. Plus, they were cheap, traveled well, and could survive the apocalypse. Or at least a supply chain delay. What made it memorable wasn't the taste, it was the texture. Soldiers described it as chewy but honest. No one pretended it was good, but no one forgot it either. It stuck to your ribs, filled the mess hall with that unmistakable stew steam smell, and reminded every soldier that toughness wasn't just a trait. It was on the menu. And let's be honest, by the time you'd finished chewing the last bite, the war might have already moved to a different time zone, but if you thought beef heart was the strangest thing tossed in an army stew pot, wait till you see what they did with pork. 3. Mock chicken legs, ground pork on skewers. You ever bite into something called chicken and immediately know you've been lied to? Welcome to mock chicken legs, a creative culinary illusion straight out of the U.S. Army mess hall. These weren't chicken, not even close. They were made from seasoned ground pork, sometimes mixed with veal or beef scraps, molded around a stick, usually a wooden skewer or bone, substitute, breaded, and then fried or baked until they looked like drumsticks. Looked, not tasted. The name was pure Army optimism. There wasn't a feather in sight, and soldiers knew it. But the outside was crispy, the inside was spiced just enough to be passable, and if you squinted, emotionally, not visually, it almost felt like home cooking. Almost. Some mess sergeants added garlic powder, mustard seed, or celery flakes to boost the illusion. Others just crossed their fingers and served it hot. But for soldiers who hadn't seen real poultry in months, this was as close as they were getting without re-enlisting as a chicken farmer. And here's the twist. Many actually liked it. Not because it was good, but because it wasn't liver. It was warm, salty, didn't jiggle, and had the courtesy to pretend it was something better. But if fake chicken was the mess hall's best deception, the next meal might just be its most creative scam. 4. Creamed salmon over toast points. Ah, yes, the Army's idea of surf and toast. Creamed salmon was the military's answer to seafood cravings without needing an ocean. Made from canned pink salmon, often packed months or years prior, this dish was mixed into a thick white sauce made from powdered milk, margarine substitute, flour, and a healthy dash of hope. The mess crew would heat it until bubbly, then ladle it over triangles of toasted white bread, or what they proudly called toast points. Sounds elegant, right? Don't be fooled. The salmon was soft, the sauce was gluey, and the bread usually gave up halfway through the meal, turning into a soggy, fish-scented sponge. Still, it had its fans. For soldiers from the Northwest or coastal towns, the dish hit something close to nostalgic. And let's be real, anything served warm with actual protein and carbs was better than another bowl of mush. The clever part? The toast made it feel more plated, even when everything came from a can. Presentation wasn't everything, but in the Army, it was all you had between dignity and defeat. Some said it was like eating seafood in a dream, if that dream involved powdered dairy and bread soaked in regret. And yet, for as strange as salmon sauce on toast might sound, it doesn't hold a candle to what the Army did with deviled ham and cabbage. 5. Deviled ham and cabbage with mustard sauce. If you thought the word deviled meant spicy, think again. In Army terms, it usually meant mashed into a paste and shoved into a can. Deviled ham was made by grinding up leftover pork trimmings, sometimes spiced, often salted to the brink of dehydration, and pressing it into a dense pink loaf that could survive nuclear winter. At mess halls, it was sliced, sometimes fried for texture, and served beside a heap of boiled cabbage. And to tie the whole thing together, a dollop of tangy yellow mustard sauce, usually mixed from dry mustard powder and lukewarm water. Now, cabbage might not sound like a luxury, but in wartime America, it was a cheap, vitamin-rich workhorse that filled bellies fast. Plus, when boiled long enough, it gave off a scent that cleared out the barracks. Efficient on multiple fronts. The real wild card was the mustard sauce. Too little, and the meal tasted like salted wallpaper. Too much, and your sinuses evacuated the premises. But just the right balance? You'd almost believe this dish had character. Soldiers joked that if you could finish a full serving without flinching, you deserved a stripe. But just when you thought canned ham paste was the bottom of the barrel, the next meal comes straight from the sea, and not the part anyone wants to visit. 6. Boiled salt cod with potatoes and parsley butter. This wasn't the kind of seafood that made you think of beaches and breezes. This was survival fish, salted stiff, shipped in crates, and soaked in water for hours just to make it chewable. Salt cod had been a staple of naval and military rations for centuries, and in World War II Army camps it made a grim little comeback. After enough soaking to revive a fossil, the fish was boiled until flaky, then served with boiled potatoes and, if you were lucky, a drizzle of melted butter mixed with dried parsley flakes. The butter was more suggestion than substance, and the parsley, well, let's just say it gave the illusion of freshness in a dish that otherwise smelled like old rope. Soldiers from New England or fishing towns might have tolerated it. The rest? Not so much. The salt content alone could rehydrate a man backwards. But to the Army, it was perfect. Long shelf life, easy to transport, full of protein, and basically indestructible. The texture? Somewhere between flaky and rubbery, depending on how long Private Jenkins remembered to soak it. And the flavor? Let's just say if the potatoes didn't save the day, the chow line behind you got shorter real fast. Still, it wasn't the strangest fish on the menu, because when it came to fake chicken, we've already had our fun. But fake eggs? That's where things got truly unhinged. 7. Powdered eggs and bacon dust with reheated Army toast. You ever crack open a bag and pour yourself some scrambled disappointment? Welcome to powdered eggs, the breakfast cornerstone of U.S. Army camps during World War II. Real eggs were fragile, expensive, and went bad faster than a second lieutenant on night patrol. So instead, the Army gave soldiers dehydrated egg powder, a fine yellow dust that smelled vaguely of chalk and cooked up into something resembling eggs if you squinted hard and ignored your taste buds. Mess cooks would whip it with water, fry it on huge griddles, and scrape it off in slabs, sometimes rubbery, sometimes runny, always yellow, but never quite egg. And next to those eggs, bacon dust, not bacon, not bits, dust. Tiny flecks of rendered pork or smoked fat scraped from the bottom of the grease bin and tossed on top like seasoning. It didn't crunch, it didn't sizzle, but it did exist, and that was enough for the Army to call it breakfast meat. All of it was served with reheated white toast, usually cold, often bent in half from the steam tray, and ready to mop up whatever dignity was left on the plate. Soldiers didn't expect breakfast in bed, but powdered eggs reminded them that some mornings even hope needed rehydration. And just when they thought breakfast couldn't get any more suspicious, dessert showed up disguised as rice pudding with raisins. 8. Rice and raisin pudding with powdered cream. Dessert in the Army was a bit like a ceasefire, brief, questionable, and rarely as sweet as you hoped. Enter rice and raisin pudding, one of the more ambitious offerings in World War II Army mess halls. Made from leftover boiled rice, sweetened with a splash of sugar and cinnamon, when available, and mixed with a handful of raisins so dry they could have passed as musket balls. The whole concoction was then drowned in powdered cream, a milky mix that was supposed to add richness, but usually just added clumps. The texture? Somewhere between oatmeal and regret. Served warm or cold, depending on how long it had been sitting. And while the raisins were meant to be a treat, soldiers often joked they were just there to remind you dessert still involved chewing. But here's the twist. Some guys loved it. Not because it was good, but because it wasn't beans. When you've eaten salted meat for 6 straight days, a mushy bowl of warm rice with sweet hints felt like a hug from a very distant, very ration-conscious aunt. Still, it was a gamble every time you took a bite. You never quite knew if you'd hit a raisin or a clump of unmixed powdered milk. But that was dessert. And if you think that was the mess hall trying to show mercy, wait till you see what they did to veal. 9. Breaded veal patties with brown gravy. This one looked like a fancy meal. It even had a nice name, breaded veal patties with brown gravy. Sounds pretty good, right? But let's slow down. These patties weren't made from soft, juicy veal like you'd get at a real restaurant. Nope, this was ground-up meat, pressed into a flat circle, rolled in crumbs, and fried until it held its shape. Kind of like a hockey puck, if hockey pucks came with sauce. The gravy helped, sort of. It was thick, salty, and brown, always brown. Army cooks poured it on everything. Even if the food was dry or chewy, the gravy made it go down easier. Some soldiers said these patties were actually pretty tasty, if you didn't ask what was in them. Others said they were just better than liver. Either way, you ate what you were given and hoped for dessert after. And if you were really hungry, you didn't even taste it. You just took a bite, chewed fast, and hoped the next tray didn't come with something that stared back at you. The best part? You could hold the whole patty with one hand and eat it like a sandwich. No fork needed, no manners required. But the next meal? It wiggled, and it came in a perfect meat-flavored cube. 10. Tripe stew with pepper gravy and bread ends. Tripe is a nice way of saying cow stomach. And yes, soldiers ate it. A lot. In Army camps, tripe stew was one of those meals that made guys stare at their tray a little longer before digging in. It was chopped into small pieces, boiled soft, and dropped into a thick, peppery gravy. Then they'd scoop it over bread ends, the leftover slices nobody wanted from earlier in the day. It smelled strong, kind of like wet leather cooked in black pepper and regret. But it was warm, filling, and packed with protein. That's all the Army really cared about. Some guys actually liked it. They said it reminded them of old country cooking, stuff their grandparents made when nothing went to waste. Others took one bite and traded trays faster than you could say kitchen duty. The bread? It soaked up the gravy, but also turned into a soggy mess. Still, it made the meal feel like a stew, instead of just a bowl of boiled stomach strips. And for some unlucky souls, the smell of it stayed in the mess hall long after lunch was over. And if you think that was the low point, hold on. The next meal didn't even try to look like food. It was square, silent, and ready for battle. 11. Canned chicken croquettes with gravy. Now this one fooled a lot of new recruits. You hear chicken croquettes, and you picture something golden, crispy, maybe even homemade. But in the Army? That name was doing a lot of heavy lifting. These croquettes came in cans. Perfect little meat blocks made from ground chicken, stale breadcrumbs, and whatever filler helped hold it together. They were plopped onto trays, sometimes baked for a crust, sometimes not. Then came the standard brown gravy, thick, salty, and poured on top like a cover-up. The texture was soft, kind of like a meat sponge. Some bites had a little crunch from the outside, but most of it just squished. If you were lucky, you could catch a whiff of real chicken. If not, it just smelled like the can it came from. Still, guys ate it. It was warm, filling, and didn't wiggle too much. That alone made it better than some of the options earlier in the week. And if you mashed it with potatoes or bread, you could almost forget it came out shaped like a tuna can. But if you thought chicken in a cube was strange, wait till the Army tried to turn turtle soup into a battlefield classic. 12. Mock turtle soup with crackers. No turtles were harmed in the making of this soup, mostly because there were never any turtles in it to begin with. Mock turtle soup was the Army's version of something rich people used to eat back in the 1800s, but instead of turtle meat, they used chopped beef or organ meat, tossed it into a thin brown broth, and called it close enough. The broth was watery, a little greasy, and had a strange mix of flavors, some beefy, some peppery, and some just confusing. Every bowl came with a few dry crackers on the side, like they were supposed to help. They didn't. Still, it was served warm, and that counted for something. On cold mornings or after drills in the rain, soldiers were just happy to hold a bowl of something that steamed. Some mess halls tried to dress it up with a hard-boiled egg or a splash of vinegar, like that would turn it into fine dining. But at the end of the day, it was still mystery meat water with a fancy name. Some guys joked that the only thing real about mock turtle soup was the disappointment. But believe it or not, the next meal might be even stranger, because it's made of rice, carrots, and something pretending to be celery. 13. Carrot and rice casserole with dried celery bits. If a dish could taste like silence, this would be it. Carrot and rice casserole was one of those meals that looked okay at first, warm, orangish, and soft. But the flavor? Almost nothing. Just boiled rice, soft carrots, and a few sad flakes of dried celery that never quite came back to life. It was made in big metal trays, scooped out in wet lumps, and served with no sauce, no meat, and no explanation. Just starch, fiber, and enough bulk to keep you from getting hungry again until maybe tomorrow. Some soldiers called it glue with vitamins. Others didn't call it anything. They just ate it fast and moved on. The real trick was how fast the mess hall could make it. This casserole was cheap, simple, and didn't need much attention. You could dump everything into a pot, stir it twice, and it'd still come out fine. And since there was no meat, no frying, and no flavor that could burn, it almost never got messed up, which made it one of the safest meals a tired cook could serve. Still, it wasn't the worst. It didn't smell bad. It didn't jiggle. It didn't fight back. In Army terms, that made it a win. But if you thought rice and carrots were boring, the next meal will prove the Army could take barley, mushrooms, and milk powder and make them even weirder. 14. Barley and mushroom stew with canned milk base. This dish tried really hard to be comfort food and almost made it. Barley and mushroom stew was thick, heavy, and looked like something your grandpa would eat if he lost a bet. It was made from cooked barley, which is kind of like chewy rice, sliced canned mushrooms, and a creamy base made from, you guessed it, powdered milk and water. The result was a bowl of beige. Not quite soup, not quite porridge, just warm, lumpy, and full of chewy bits that never quite softened. The mushrooms gave it a nice earthy flavor, but the powdered milk made it taste like someone added baby formula by accident. It was also one of those meals that filled you up fast. A few bites in, and your stomach was already waving the white flag. But for the army, that was perfect. Feed the men, keep 'em moving, and don't spend a dime more than you have to. The real problem came when it got cold. Once that creamy base cooled down, the whole thing turned into one solid blob. Still, it beats going hungry, but don't get too comfortable, because next up is a dish so strange the army didn't even know if it was lunch or dessert. A cheesy loaf that looked like cake, but definitely wasn't sweet. 15. Cheese and macaroni loaf with tomato gravy. Sounds kind of tasty, right? You hear cheese and macaroni, and you think of comfort food. Something warm, creamy, maybe even cheesy. But then the army turned it into a loaf, and things got weird real fast. This meal was made by smashing together cooked macaroni, processed cheese, powdered milk, dried eggs, and breadcrumbs into one big block. Then it was baked until solid, sliced like meatloaf, and drowned in something called tomato gravy, which was basically watered-down ketchup with a bad attitude. The texture? Spongy. The flavor? Mostly salt, with a hint of school lunch memories. The loaf held its shape so well you could drop it on the floor and it'd bounce. But hey, it was vegetarian, so at least it didn't come from an animal's weird leftover parts like half the other meals on this list. Some soldiers didn't mind it. It was soft, hot, and didn't smell like anything terrible. Others said it looked like birthday cake but tasted like wet cardboard and regret. Still, it was easy to serve, cheap to make, and filled you up. That made it a hit with the mess hall cooks, even if nobody ever asked for seconds. But believe it or not, this wasn't the strangest loaf in the chow line. That title goes to a meat and liver combo that made even the toughest guys reach for the salt shaker, and maybe their canteen. 16. Liver loaf with reconstituted mashed potatoes. Just hearing the words liver loaf was enough to make some soldiers lose their appetite, but that didn't stop the army from serving it. Again, and again, and again. This loaf was made by grinding up beef liver, mixing it with breadcrumbs, powdered eggs, onions, if they had them, and baking the whole thing into a firm brown block. Once it was cooked, it was sliced into neat little slabs and plopped next to a scoop of reconstituted mashed potatoes, basically flakes mixed with hot water until they looked like something you could call food. The liver loaf had a strong smell, real strong, like rusty metal mixed with boiled socks. The taste? Metallic, chewy, and weirdly sweet. The mess hall would sometimes add gravy to help, but even that couldn't hide the fact that you were eating something most people throw away. The mashed potatoes weren't much better. They were fluffy, sure, but in the same way packing peanuts are fluffy. You had to eat them fast before they dried up and turned back into powder. Some guys just smothered the whole thing in hot sauce and took big bites without thinking. Others traded it away for crackers or even more powdered eggs. But if you think liver loaf was rock bottom, the next meal takes a sweet turn. Kind of. It's fruit, yes, but it comes straight from a can and lands right in your dessert dish. 17. Canned fruit cocktail with syrup. This was supposed to be the treat, the bright spot. The you made it through another chow line without gagging reward. Canned fruit cocktail was a mix of soft peaches, pears, grapes, and the occasional mystery cube, all floating in thick, sticky syrup that could double as glue. It was cold, sweet, and came straight from a giant metal can, usually plopped into a dented cup or onto the corner of your tray like a sad little celebration. At first glance it looked colorful and happy. A tiny rainbow in a brown and gray world of army food. But looks were deceiving. The fruit was mushy, the grapes were squished, and the cherries? If you even got one, it was like finding gold. Still, soldiers loved it. After days of meat paste, boiled cabbage, and powdered gravy, a spoonful of soft fruit swimming in sugar water tasted like heaven. Some guys even saved it for last, eating it slow to make the moment last longer. And hey, it had vitamins. That made it healthy, right? But don't get too excited, because right after dessert came another dose of reality, a dish so plain, so dry, and so forgettable. Most soldiers only remembered it when it showed up again the next week. 18. Split pea mash with ham fat drizzle. This meal had one job: fill your stomach and don't ask questions. Split pea mash was exactly what it sounds like: boiled peas cooked until they fell apart into a thick green mush. No chunks, no texture, no surprises. Just a heavy, smooth scoop of pea paste plopped onto your tray like it had been waiting there all day. To make it better, mess cooks would drizzle it with ham fat, the leftover grease skimmed off fried pork or boiled ham from earlier in the week. That fat added flavor, sure, but also gave the dish a shiny, oily coat that made it slide around your tray like it had somewhere else to be. The taste? Earthy, salty, a little smoky if the ham fat was fresh. And if it wasn't? Well, you chewed faster and didn't make eye contact with the cook. It was hot, it was filling, and it stuck to your ribs, and your spoon, and maybe your uniform if you weren't careful. Some guys called it green cement, others just called it dinner and moved on. And if you let it sit too long, it turned into a cold green brick you could probably use to patch a Jeep. But if you thought that was heavy, wait till you see what happened when they baked sweet potatoes with dried beef. 19. Dried beef and sweet potato hash. This one came straight from the Army's Make Do With What You've Got cookbook. They'd take thin slices of dried beef, tough, salty stuff packed in cans, and toss it in a skillet with chopped up sweet potatoes. Then came the onions, maybe a bit of leftover bacon grease, and a whole lot of wishful thinking. It sizzled and smelled pretty good, but the texture? That depended on how long the cook let it sit. Sometimes it was crispy and golden, other times it was just mush. But hungry soldiers didn't complain. It was hot, it had meat, and it didn't come out of a can, mostly. Some camps even served it for breakfast, right next to scrambled eggs and a black cup of coffee that could wake the dead. And if the sweet potatoes ran out, they just used white potatoes, canned carrots, or whatever root was lying around. It wasn't about taste. It was about fuel. And for guys running drills all morning, this was the gut filler they needed. The hash hit heavy, but it wasn't fancy. And for Southern boys especially, it was just the warm-up act, because the next mess hall mystery was greens, pork fat, and dumplings thick enough to patch a Jeep tire. 20. Turnip greens with pork cracklins and cornmeal dumplings. This dish came straight out of Depression-era cookbooks, cheap, simple, and surprisingly filling. Turnip greens were boiled down until soft, then mixed with salty little bits of fried pork fat called cracklins. These weren't bacon bits. They were tougher, crunchier, and full of flavor, the kind that made your lips greasy and your plate worth finishing. Alongside the greens came cornmeal dumplings, heavy, doughy balls made from cornmeal, water, and not much else. They soaked up the pork fat like little sponges and sat in your belly like a warm brick. Some soldiers hated it. The greens were bitter, the cracklins were chewy, and the dumplings stuck to your ribs like cement. But others loved it, especially guys from the South who grew up on meals just like it. The best part? You could mop the whole thing up with a piece of bread and be full till tomorrow. The worst part? You'd probably burp pork grease halfway through drills. It wasn't pretty, and it sure wasn't light, but it was the kind of meal that made you feel like you could lift a truck right after, or fall asleep standing up. But if you thought that was rustic, wait till the Army served up cold chopped meat soaked in vinegar with a side of purple beets that dyed everything it touched. 21. Cold meat salad with vinegar dressing and canned beets. This one looked more like a dare than a dish. Army cooks would take leftover canned ham, beef, or whatever meat didn't get eaten the night before, chop it up cold, Then mix it with diced onions, pickles, and sometimes even peas, all tossed in a sharp vinegar dressing that could peel paint off a Jeep. To make it look fancy, they'd slap some canned beets on the side, bright red, slippery little discs that bled into everything and made the plate look like it lost a fight. Soldiers said it tasted zippy.